Chris's brilliant book, A British State, A Warning. And I read this book last week, and I absolutely love it. So it's a real honour to be here launching a book with Chris, who I'm proud to call a great friend. Chris is going to speak for a few minutes, and then we're going to have a chat, and then we're going to open up the floor. So without further ado, please welcome the brilliant Chris Nineham.
Well, thanks everyone for coming, and I'd like to take the opportunity of thanking Zer0 Books and Doug Lane and everyone at the Zer0 for getting the book out very, very quickly. And I'd also like to say thanks to everyone who's helped with the kind of production of the book and the ideas, many of the ideas behind the book, and many of you are here tonight, so thanks a lot. And in a different way, I'd like to thank Boris Johnson and the Queen and the Metropolitan Police for kind of, in the last few weeks, making a number of my arguments for me. Partly by suspending Parliament, by stopping XR protesting and so on and so forth. So that's been helpful. I suppose one of the things that I'm trying to do in the book is to answer a puzzle, which is how is it that the British state has managed to self-present as a country, and by the way, by the state I mean all the institutions that govern society. I mean the police, the civil service, the security services, the army, the parts of the media and Parliament. How is it that the British state has managed to present itself as the kind of home of gradualism, as the cradle of democracy, and Westminster, of course, is the mother of all parliaments? Because it is, when you look at the history, it is a state that was born in revolution and in the violent occupation of Ireland and then of Scotland. It pioneered the slave trade, or was one of the pioneers of the slave trade. It brutally ran the biggest empire the world has ever seen. It's been involved in a series of global and local wars ever since, right up to the present day. And domestically, it's been engaged in, particularly in the 19th century, the very, very violent repression of a whole series of democracy movements, to be honest. And also, it was actually a state where democracy came very late. We only got the universal suffrage in this country in 1928, 91 years ago, which means that's like 28 or 30 other countries got there first. So how is it that we've got this idea of, you know, Britain being this kind of paragon of democracy? There's a whole number of different answers to that question, and we'll kind of probably come back to them. Some of them are actually things that apply to capitalist states around the world. Some of them are very, very specific. But we'll come on to them. What I want to start with, and what I want to be quite blunt about, are the kind of immediate questions that confront us, and the questions really that made me write this book. And that is that we are in a time when there's a huge amount of anger, a huge amount of bitterness about the way society is being run. We're at a time when we possibly have the chance of the first radical Labour government for generations. And yet it seems to me there's very, very little discussion about these kind of questions. And, you know, there's kind of amnesia about the history that I write about in this book, and about the many, many obstacles that the state places in the way of any kind of radical change. And, you know, I think socialists need to be the memory of the working class, and I think it's very important that we do seriously address these things. Now, I can't go through the whole history now, obviously. I just want to make a few basic points that I think outline a few basic facts that should be much better known. And the first one is that democracy was not granted in this country by a benevolent, caring, inclusive ruling class who decided to just, you know, widen the franchise gradually through a process of negotiation. It was won by a cycle of really massive social struggles. I mean, people know a bit about Peterloo and the big battles around 1819 in Britain, but there was an almost unspoken of semi-insurgency in Britain in 1832, where whole cities were taken over by what were charmingly called the mob, and it was only rolled back by a massive level of repression. There was, of course, the Chartist movement towards the middle of the 19th century, which is the first great working class movement in the world. There was then, in the second half of the 19th century, huge demonstrations that managed to force the 1867 Reform Act through, and then there's the suffragettes in the 20th century that people know a little bit more about. That seems to me to be one thing that we need to get out there on the table, that democracy was won through a massive, massive level of mainly working class struggle in this country. Number two, most of the core institutions of the British state that I mentioned actually predate democracy. And not only that, but they were shaped and almost designed in such a way as to, first of all, try and stop democracy happening, and secondly, try and limit it when the establishment started to believe that it was kind of inevitable that it was going to take place. I'll give you a couple of examples. One is the police force, which was, let me just have a drink of water. The police force was set up in the 1830s in this country, actually as a response, almost entirely as a response to massive protests and campaigns and movements. And the kind of liberal wing of the British ruling class decided that the last resort kind of strategy that was on display at Peterloo, which was basically stab 'em and shoot 'em, needed to be replaced with a policy of maim 'em and arrest 'em, basically. And this is exactly what the police was all about. I mean, if you read, it's quite amazing, you read the documents, the discussions, it was a long argument about what should be done. The thing about the police is they didn't have to have both hands on a musket. They had on one hand they had a baton in order to concuss people. On the other hand, their other hand was free in order to detain them, basically. And literally that is the kind of discussion around the police force. The civil service was something approaching the kind of modern civil service. It was set up in the 1870s in Britain, and it was set up when the more far-sighted sections of the ruling class began to realise that democracy was probably going to happen. So they wanted to have a professional, permanent body of people who would basically administer the country, and politicians could come and go, but these were the people that were really going to be governing, and they were selected with absolute detailed attention to their class backgrounds, and they were all people. The people who ran the civil service were and still are people who have 100 ties to the establishment and the capitalist class. Most of them come from Oxford and Cambridge, even to this day, the top ones. Almost all of them who weren't aristocrats did during the 19th century. And the whole purpose of the civil service was to have a body of people who were guaranteed loyal to what Lord Balfour called the foundations of society, by which he meant basically property and profit. And that was where the civil service came from. Obviously, there have been important kind of modifications, and that's just two institutions of the state, obviously, but there clearly have been important modifications since then through the end of the 19th century, the 20th century, and so forth. But the third thing the third sort of political fact or historical fact I want to stress is that right from that point up to our own time, the institutions of the state, the unelected institutions of the state, have been used to suppress and attack social movements and to sabotage and derail any Labour government that tries to get any kind of change. And I give a whole number of examples, obviously, in the book. But I just want to focus on one which is kind of the most relevant and the most immediate, which is the experience of the 1974-79 Labour government, which, as some of you will know, came in on the back of a huge strike wave, came in on the most radical manifesto Labour has ever had, which even talked about kind of democratising industry, some level of kind of workers' control. And the most left-wing member of that government was Tony Benn, who was Minister of Industry, and he was a particular target, unsurprisingly, of the state institutions. In his diaries, which I recommend as kind of required reading, particularly the period of the 1970s, actually, he talks about his permanent civil service secretary. He was a man called Sir Anthony Part, who he said, Ben said, treated him, Ben, like a consultant psychiatrist would a particularly dangerous patient. And right at the beginning, when he first came into office, this guy, Sir Anthony Part, said to him, "Are you really going to go ahead with your economic programme?" And Tony Benn said, "Well, obviously, you know, I'm elected on that basis, we're elected on that basis, that's what we're going to do." And Sir Anthony Part said straight back to him, "Well, in that case, you will be headed for as big a confrontation with industrial management as the last government had with the unions." And Sir Anthony Part doesn't sound like a particularly humorous kind of a geezer, if you read about him in Ben's diaries, and he actually wasn't joking, because that's exactly what happened to the last radical Labour government. They faced massive levels of obstruction from the civil service, a whole range of dirty tricks from the security services, coup attempts, or the beginnings, at least plans and plots to organise coups, which were partly there to destabilise the government. All of this backed up by the right wing of the media. And then they got elected in 74, and by 75, a kind of concerted economic attack on them by the Bank of England, the International Monetary Fund, supported by the corporates, leading to investment strikes and deliberately manufactured runs on the pound. And this operation, we have to be honest, was extremely successful. By 1976, effectively, the left in the cabinet had been isolated. Tony Benn was sacked from his, well, he was demoted from his industry position, apparently on a direct kind of request from the City of London. And by the beginning of 1976, the whole economic programme went into reverse. And the government surrendered effectively and started to institute a programme of austerity and of cuts. That was the first major such programme since the Second World War, and actually led to the biggest decline of working class living standards since the 1920s, and instituted, by some measures, cuts much deeper than Thatcher ever managed in any one government. This was an absolute disaster, and it led, apart from anything else, I mean, it's a disaster in terms of its experience, but it also provided the basis on which Thatcher could come to office. So, you know, not pretty, really. And I'm sorry to be, you know, I don't want to bring people down, but I think these are facts that, you know, need to be addressed and need to be looked at. Now, it seems to me that since those days, mainly thanks to Thatcher and Blair, we now have a situation where state institutions are much more fused, actually, with corporate power and big business and finance capital than they were back then. An amazing 50% of government spending at the moment goes to private companies. And it's not just that, it's also the case that at every level of control, business actually has an in to the state, to state decision making. Lots of the decisions that are made on all sorts of different fronts actually take place with heads of business in the room talking to civil service. There's that incredible level of integration that is going on. And that's going to make things even harder. And to add to that, I think the recent cycle of wars has meant that the kind of security services, and by the way, Britain has the biggest security service of any Western country outside of the US. But I think the generals, the military, the security services have a much stronger and more embedded role and more kind of front of house role in the British state than they have done any time since certainly the Second World War. If a Corbyn government gets elected, I think we have to say, on anything like the kind of radical programme that he outlined, that Jeremy himself outlined at the last Labour conference, we are going to have very, very serious challenges, and that's really what I think the most, you know, that's the kind of jumping off point and the starting point for the book, really. And I don't think there's any way that we should believe that big business, the institutions of the state, are just going to let this thing unroll. They're going to let it happen without putting up serious obstacles. The idea that some put forward of a kind of non-aggression pact seems to me to be fantasy. I mean, part of the evidence of this, actually, is that already, even when he's not in office, we've seen a whole kind of soft power operation, really quite coordinated on different fronts against Jeremy, clearly. We've seen the coordinated accusations of anti-Semitism. We've seen civil servants circulating lies about his health or his mental abilities. We've seen, actually, generals in the Times newspaper threatening mutinies at the top level, should he be elected. You know, this kind of stuff has all been happening already. And I must say, I read and I interpret a good deal of the push to try and get Jeremy to accept a Remain position and turn Labour into an entirely Remain party as part of a soft power operation against him. It's run by the People's Vote, which is Blairite, which is fully embedded inside the establishment, and I think it has to be seen in that light as well. Clearly, one of the big dangers we face is not just thinking about, okay, let's get him in and then we've got to defend him and so on and so forth. Actually, even before he gets there, the danger is that these kind of powers can neuter him and really limit his capacity to change things. So just to conclude, I mean, obviously Corbynism and the whole experience in the Labour Party over the last 4 years has helped to popularise socialist ideas massively and kind of made the idea of real change something that millions of people see now as a possibility. It's focused that anger and those aspirations in a way that has been fantastically important. It's also opened a door. I think there's no question about it. It's opened a door that the left can move through, and you know, that's absolutely crucial. But I think what we have to recognise is that we're only going to be able to move through it if we understand that this isn't just about Parliament. That actually, you know, the parliamentary politics can open up possibilities and opportunities, but they can only be taken if we're organised in every community, in every workplace, in every city up and down the country, if the movement is capable of mobilising on a massive scale in defence of a potential radical Labour government and against the right that will definitely move against it. It seems to me that all history tells us that without that kind of mobilisation, it's simply not going to be possible for a parliamentary operation to deliver. And that's why I want to end on a slightly different kind of angle of the question of the state, because I hope you've all been following to some extent the incredible wave of massive protest movements that have spread around the globe in the last, last months, but particularly accelerated in the last few weeks. And it seems to me that one of the things that is so remarkable about these protest movements is the speed at which they have turned into, I mean, they have a number of different starting points, mainly economic, but the speed at which they have turned into rebellions against governments. And it seems to me that speaks to a kind of one of the outcomes of neoliberalism, actually, over the last 40 years, which is precisely the extent to which the state and government is kind of integrated with big business, has been hollowed out and is fusing with big business. And that is something that people recognise, and that is something that people get angry about. And that means that people can very quickly jump from saying, I'm against the metro hike in Chile, but I understand that this is partly the fault of the politicians and the corporates who are hand in hand trying to rob us. And that's in difficult times, that's a very, very hopeful sign, because it means the possibility of developing the kind of political mass movements that I believe is so important and that we need here as well as everywhere else is wide open. I think we can get change in this country, because I think a good deal of the same anger, obviously different places are different, and so far these revolts have taken place mainly in the Middle East and in Latin America, but you can see how that kind of spirit could translate into countries in Europe and potentially into Britain, because the anger is there, and the anger is focused in very much the same way. It's focused against the Westminster elites, who are seen as being part of a corporate takeover and seen as being part of a kind of very, very brutal, predatory, globalised capitalism. So that seems to me to be a kind of thumbnail sketch of what I'm talking about. And I have to say that task of mobilising on that kind of scale, which I think is I mean, I actually think there'll be big protests will take place whatever the left does. I think that's almost inevitable. But I mean, if we're going to address ourselves seriously to the task of changing things, I think we have to not see politics as something that simply happens in Parliament. We have to see politics as something much wider in our communities, in our workplaces and so forth. And we have to recognise that this task will not be done through the official institutions at all. Obviously, getting generally elected is an important part of it, but the job of mobilising people on the ground won't be done through the official institutions. I don't actually believe it will be done via the Labour Party either. I think it'll be done via the trade unions, by the mass movements, and I also think that it will require the development of a viable, really dynamic, extra-parliamentary left at the same time. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Chris. There's so much there to talk about. I found it a brilliant overview of the history of our state, and I wish it was taught in all schools.
Oh.
I think we'll be living in such a different country and climate if that was the case. And I wish I'd grown up with this detailed knowledge, because you really write very compellingly about how the British state is really a tool used by the elites to further their own interests while kind of restricting democracy and rights and freedoms, and also kind of any crumbs of freedoms that we had been allowed had been really granted to us to counter the threat of revolution. And quite rightly you point out that there isn't this benevolent elite going, oh, okay, we want to make your lives better. So I guess my first question, I want to jump in, just follow up on what you said about Jeremy Corbyn. And do you think he's the biggest threat the British state has ever faced? And if so, why?
He's not here, is he? No. No, I don't think. I don't think that the kind of the whole Corbyn project is the biggest threat the British state has ever faced. I think I talk about it in my book. I mean, I think that probably, 1832 was a very, very serious crisis. Actually, I mean, they really were. There was lots of talk of revolution on both sides. I mean, in the mass movements, amongst the elites as well, because obviously, the spectre of the French Revolution was still very, very strong in people's minds. And in 1830, there was another wave of revolutions starting in France, and they were absolutely terrified of losing control at that point. And as I say, Bristol was completely lost. For a week, Bristol was in the control of the Bristolians. And Nottingham Castle was burned down, and for 4 days Nottingham was lost as well. There was serious, they were running their, and this speaks to the police thing, I mean, they were running their soldiers all around the country, but because the railways weren't developed, they had to actually march up and down the country. So it was like, they couldn't get there quick enough to kind of control the situation. So there was real panic in 1832. But I would say more recently, probably the period after the First World War was the biggest crisis the British state has ever experienced. There was a police strike and a big army mutinies after the First World War, and very, very closely following on from them, there was a huge strike wave, including some sort of almost openly insurrectionary strikes in Glasgow, but also the so-called Triple Alliance, which was the miners and the rail workers and the transport unions came together to say we're going to have a massive strike. They were opened up a new front, and you read the cabinet papers at the time, and all they talked about was strikes and how they were going to stop the strikes. I mean, it was really chaotic. And actually, the way that it was resolved was that the strikers were brought in to see the Prime Minister, and the Prime Minister just said at the time, look, basically, if the Triple Alliance goes on strike, the country will be paralysed, the state cannot respond because the soldiers and police are not reliable. So what I'm saying to you, trade union leaders, is, are you ready to take over? And it's very, very interesting, actually, that was the turning point, because the relatively left-wing miners' union leader, a guy called Robert Smiley, writes in his diary soon after that it was at that moment that they knew they were beaten. So, that tells you something about the way power operates, and it tells you something about the importance of politics on our side when it comes to taking opportunities. Just to come back to the present day, I mean, what I do think is that Corbyn and Corbynism represents the biggest achievement by the left in the Labour Party there has ever been. There's never been a time when the Labour Party, the left has been leading the Labour Party. Jeremy's the most left-wing leader the Labour Party has ever had. And, you know, this has been a very, very long struggle between the left and the right in the Labour Party. And it's certainly the biggest opening there's ever been in terms of Labour Party politics. And therefore, you know, it could become the biggest challenge to the British state. But as I say, I think that requires a kind of fusion of the exploiting the political crisis and the political advances we've made with a movement from below.
And you rightly point out in the book and also in your speech that the potential challenges that a Corbyn government would face are rarely discussed on the left. I don't know if it's because it's so daunting that everyone goes, oh, let's not look at that. Because let's be honest, it is sobering, it is a huge obstacle to even contemplate. How can we on the left engage more? And how important is it that we do look at these difficult questions and try and build some kind of consensus?
Well, I mean, you know, I think, funnily enough, I think part of the reason why, I mean, I spoke at the beginning about, you know, why is it that the kind of bloody history of British rule, both domestically and internationally, gets so little discussion. I think, I have to say, I think one of the reasons is the kind of dominance of Labourist politics in the British working class movement, because I mean, lots of social democratic parties in different parts of the world have ended up accommodating to capitalism in lots of different ways. But almost uniquely, and perhaps actually uniquely, the British Labour Party was from the start completely accepting of, you know, state institutions and had its policy as being one of non-confrontation and of being a party that was 100% dedicated to fighting within the main institutions. And I think, you know, that's a very big intellectual legacy that has kind of had a big effect on the way working class people in this country. I mean, I'm not saying that's the only reason, but I think that is one of the reasons. And, you know, part of that is this question of memory and history and so forth. I sort of feel sometimes that the Labour Party, and here I'm not talking about the Corbyn section of the Labour Party, but the Labour Party in general and historically has been the kind of amnesia of the working class, actually. The institutional amnesia of the working class, and has kind of helped to bury all of this history that I talk about. And I do think it is very, very important because, as I say, unless we understand our history, it's very hard to know how we can seriously move forward. But I think, you know, I mean, one of the things about Corbynism is that it comes out of, it's quite a complex process, but it's come out of street movements, funnily enough. If you look at it historically, I think it's very, very important that, you know, the anti-war movement, the anti-austerity movement, the pro-Palestine movement, all of these things were kind of foundational to Jeremy's challenge. I think it was precisely because he was involved in those things, because he was known as the person who was always on the picket line, always on the protest. That's the reason why at the time when people were crying out for change, he was the one who got back. People say it was an accident, and obviously, you know, funnily enough, the one favour Tony Blair did to the British working class movement was the change in constitution that allowed Jeremy to get elected. But really, I think that's what this was about. It was a kind of insurgency into Labour. So I don't actually think that, you know, these ideas are completely foreign to a lot of people. I think a lot of people kind of know them at the back of their minds. I mean, it's not as if people on the left don't know about empire, they do. It's not as if people on the left don't know about Peterloo or the suffragettes, they do. It's a question of kind of joining the dots, actually, and thinking about, and ensuring that people don't just have those things in the back of their minds, but actually do think, okay, this is a serious set of problems, it's a serious set of issues, we need to plan, we need to strategise, we need to think seriously about what we're going to do about it. And it seems to me, you know, I don't actually think there's loads of people in Labour who, on the Labour left, who would disagree with this book, funnily enough. I think probably people agree with it. The point is, are we going to do anything about it? Are we actually going to... And there's been other books. There's a book called People Get Ready, which has just come out by some Labour Corbyn supporters, which is an interesting book and starts from some of the same propositions in terms of the state. But it doesn't actually come out with any kind of conclusion, any kind of answer. Strategically, what do we need to do? And crucially, it doesn't come out with this question of, let's think seriously. How are we going to get to a situation where, if and when Jeremy gets elected, that we can get people out into the street to defend him? That seems to me to be the million-dollar question, and that's the question we've got to address ourselves in a very, very serious way too.
Do you think a lot of the reluctance to face these questions comes from an assumption of that real change isn't possible in that way, that the state is unfortunately cultivated to work a certain way, and that we'd be almost fantasists to even attempt to change the very structure and fabric of it? Do you think people really don't believe that profound change can happen?
Yeah, I do think that's a strong part of the thing. I think there's a strange thing on the left, where, or parts of the left, where, and I'm not quite sure why it is, but where people sometimes tend to underestimate the level of consciousness that exists in wider society. And actually, if you look at the history of the last 30, 40 years, there was never a time in British society when the majority of working class people thought Thatcher was a good thing, thought privatisation was a good thing, thought the free market was a good thing, thought that society shouldn't get less unequal, thought that trade union rights weren't a good thing. The fact, even at the darkest days of Thatcherism, people really didn't like it. The problem is they'd been beaten. Yeah. That was the fundamental, well, two problems. A, they'd been beaten, and B, actually, particularly the Labour leadership at the time, under Kinnock and then obviously later on under Blair, they really did internalise this idea that there's no, when Thatcher said there is no alternative, Kinnock was echoing that 3 or 4 years later. And of course, Thatcher, who was in many ways, a brilliant strategy, whatever the word is. She's very good at strategy.
I'm not going to say it.
She actually said, when asked, what is your most enduring and most important legacy? She said Tony Blair. Yeah. And I think that's, that combination of ruthless defeat and the miners' strike. That was a full spectrum state operation to crush a group of workers with high levels of violence, media coordination, a whole kind of state organised scabbing operation. It was absolutely vicious. That defeat plus the capitulation of Labour, I think, created a situation where people think, no one wants change. Actually, people are angry.
And interestingly, you write about how close the miners' strike came to being successful. If the movement had been a little bit more bold and confident, there's a great bit about when Thatcher thought she'd be beaten, and you kind of think, my God, if the left had held its nerve a bit more, we could be living in a very different world.
No, absolutely, yeah. There's 3 times that, if you look at, you can read about Thatcher's private papers. There's 3 moments during the miners' strike when she thought she was beaten. 2 of them were times when other workers came out on strike, and it looked as if there was going to be a second front opened up, and she knew that there was no way, if there was a second front, that she'd be able to resist. So and again, it wasn't a problem. Society was very polarised by the miners' strike because already quite a lot of, there had been quite a lot of defeats even before that. So, it wasn't a simple question, but there were millions and millions of working class people who supported the miners. It wasn't a question simply of, no one supported them, they were isolated. Yeah. It was a question again of the job wasn't done of mobilising the massive support in the most effective way possible. And when I remember myself actually when the Dockers came out in during the miners' strike, and it really did look as if it was all over, that the government was going to fall, and the Dockers came out on a slightly different question, on their own question, but criminally, the trade union leadership and the Labour Party just didn't see the importance of as you say, and to borrow a story of John's, there's that fantastic interview with Maurice Sarchi, who was Thatcher's one of Thatcher's sort of PR people, in the recent documentary about Thatcher, where asked about what their strategy was. Maurice Sarchi said, our strategy was to hit first, hit hard, and keep hitting. And the shame of it is, and the tragedy is, that the working class movement hasn't had that same approach.
So we need to really learn those lessons to not buckle at those crucial moments. So you've written 103 pages on how, I did my homework, on how...
Was that homework?
No, it was great homework.
That was an easy assignment.
So you've written this book on how class oppression is deeply hardwired into the very fabric of our state. You've convinced me. So I'd like to know, how do you retain hope that it can be changed to serve the interests of the masses?
Well, I mean, quite easily, really, to be honest.
Do tell.
Partly I don't share the pessimism of some people on the left about what people think. I think there's a much higher degree of understanding of these kind of issues in the wider society than a lot of people think. And I also think that, as we are seeing in different parts of the world at the moment, when you get mass movements, as we saw, as I say, during the miners' strike, as we saw to some extent during the anti-war movement back in 2003, when large numbers of people start to mobilise on a massive scale, the state can't cope, really. It relies on its kind of agents in, that's putting it too conspiratorially, but its kind of supporters in the movement to keep things under control. And once that control starts to evaporate, then you've seen in Ecuador, in Chile, in Lebanon, you've seen already the ruling class has made loads of retreats. It's backed down, and even when they back down, that doesn't stop the thing, because people start to feel their own power, and that's always been what socialism really is about. It's not about voting for someone else to set you free. It's about popular participation. It's about ordinary people beginning to take control of their own lives. And you've seen that. You've seen the political situation in these countries move very, very quickly. And the other reason for hope, one of the many other reasons for hope, I believe, is that actually the crisis that's going on in the moment in British society is first and foremost a crisis of the establishment. It's caused a lot of problems on our side, obviously, and those are things that we should discuss. But first and foremost, you have this bizarre situation where the oldest party of the oldest sort of capitalist party in Europe, possibly the world, the most successful, the Tory party, has suddenly taken a position of being pro-Brexit when its backers and sponsors, the corporate elite, are in general for staying in Europe. And that's a very, very weird situation. It's a very, very troubling situation for the ruling class. They're not happy. They know that this is very, very problematic. It's leading to a deep, profound crisis in politics and in political parties. It's leading to a kind of a set of constitutional crises which aren't good for the establishment. One of the things that Marx and Marxists talk about is that when society goes into crisis, it tends to expose the real structures of power. And when you get a situation where, Boris Johnson goes to the Queen and they get to close down Parliament, it's like people start to ask questions, well, actually, who is really in control here? Is it true that Parliament is in control? Well, it's not really true. So I think there's all sorts of things about, it is a difficult situation. I don't want to downplay that, of course, and there's all sorts of, and I don't think things are looking absolutely fantastic in terms of what's going on in the Labour Party at the moment. But if you step back a bit, what you're talking about is a profound crisis of legitimacy of the British state, which is taking place alongside similar crises in different countries around the world. And that surely has to be a moment if the left has any sense and has any conviction, that surely has to be a moment that the left can take advantage of.
I like your hope. Thank you. Hope is so important, isn't it?
It is.
Leon, you write quite a lot about the historical separation of politics and economics. And that was really interesting to read about, and obviously it has had profound implications. Primarily, it means that Parliament doesn't really interfere with economics. You know, it's not really in their realm, and I think, as you say, that's a very deliberate ploy to kind of separate them. How important do you think it is that we break down this division and actually bring questions of economics, which, let's face it, is the primary force shaping all our lives, into public and political debate?
No, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, this is in a way, this is the most important question. The most important reason why democracy is so limited in capitalist society in general and British society as well is that democracy only applies to the political sphere, and it doesn't apply at all to economics. You know, and economics is the most important thing in our lives. You know, the amount of hours we work, the kind of conditions we have at work, whether we're unionised, our pay, our rent. All of these questions are, broadly speaking, and in general, regarded as being taboo and outside of what Parliament is allowed to do. And this is the secret, actually, to the kind of, you know, the limitations of parliamentary democracy. This is the big way, the big, you know, the sort of master plan, if you like. Now, it's not actually a master plan in the sense that it actually kind of it kind of develops out of capitalism in a semi-spontaneous way, because, I mean, without going into the long thing, under previous class rules, for example, feudalism, economic and political power were fused in the sort of the hands of the lord, who basically went to the peasants and just took stuff, you know, with force. And so the way in which economic accumulation took place of profits for the ruling class was both political and economic. Capitalism does it slightly different. It happens in the free market, which appears to be separate, which appears to be something that is not actually political. And so this separation is partly spontaneous, but it is something, and it's very, very interesting reading the stuff about the 19th century. Many of the people who instituted, the liberals who instituted some of the reforms that led to the vote, they were very aware of this. You know, they argued with the Tories, listen, don't worry. What we're going to do is we're going to have a kind of a democracy in politics which, you know, it won't upset the basic foundations of society. It won't upset who owns the factories, because we'll say, you know, the trade unions and what happens in the economy and factories, that's over there. And yes, they can go on strike for a few more pounds, but they won't be political. We'll keep politics to the political sphere and keep economics to the economic sphere. And that's the secret to the power. To really, that's the fundamental secret to capitalist power. Now, as I say, I think at the moment, one of the things that's happening is that process is beginning to erode. You know, precisely because you've got a situation where big business is sitting in Whitehall with the civil servants, telling the civil servants what to do. The MPs aren't there, by the way, sometimes. The ministers aren't there very often. This is what a quango is. You know, it's basically, and Whitehall is run by quangos. You know, it's where the civil servants meet the big business people. So you've got this fusion of the political and the economic happening in the state. Now, you know, that's happening behind closed doors, but don't tell me people aren't aware of it. And so I think, you know, again, this is one of the things that I think could be happening at the moment, the beginnings of an understanding of the way those two things are linked in. And so we have the possibility of saying, okay, you know, they've got a political state. Let's have a political mass movement. Let's have political trade unionism. You know, that's the kind of argument we need to put, I think.
I don't want to hug you all night, Chris. I am going to open up the floor. I just have one more question that I'd like to throw at you. So obviously we've been seeing the XR process grow around the world, which has been very heartening. But climate change really means that we have a very short window of time to achieve profound political change. And in a way, we've never faced such a ticking clock before. We don't have decades stretching out in front of us to change things. We've got to do it now, pretty much. So how can we fuel the movement with a sense of urgency that this can't be a slow process? This has to happen really quickly, and it has to dominate politics to achieve the change that we need.
Well, I think urgency is a part anyway of what people feel about the political situation at the moment. I think, one of the reasons why this rank outsider, Jeremy Corbyn, got elected to the leadership of the Labour Party was precisely because people felt, that fundamental things have got to change. So in a way, that feeling is already there, and I think it is being reinforced by the growing consciousness of the climate catastrophe that is unfortunately around the corner. And I think actually the way in which that argument has been won in wider society, or at least amongst the majority of the population, is testimony partly to the power of extra-parliamentary action. Yeah. If it hadn't been for the school students, if it hadn't been for XR taking to the streets, then I don't believe that people would be so clear about I'm not saying the argument's been won totally, of course it hasn't, but nevertheless, I don't think that the arguments would have been won anything like so clear. I don't think there'd have been a debate in the media. The liberal media like to promote themselves as being the fount of all knowledge and consciousness and stuff. They wouldn't be talking about the climate crisis if it hadn't been for Laura Thunberg and the XR people. That's the truth, and I think we need to have a different sense of understanding of history, actually, that in almost every case, big progress in society hasn't been imposed from above, even by radical social democratic parties. Big changes in society, they play out in complex ways, but almost invariably come from initiatives taken by ordinary people and from initiatives that go into the street. So, that's the hope. And I think when it comes to the strategic question, it seems to me about XR and so forth and climate, it seems to me to be the same as ones that you're probably going to see emerging in many different parts of the world at the moment, which is that how does a conscious, I hesitate to use the word vanguard, but I kind of will use it because it explains what I mean, a kind of advanced element of working class people, or sometimes other classes as well, who understand a particular problem and want to do something about it. How do they go about the business of finding leverage to get change? And it seems to me that is all about thinking, strategically about, widening the movement, about connecting the question of climate change to the question of war, to the question of austerity, to the other sort of things that people are very, very angry about. And that has to be the process. You can't just have a few thousand people. That's not how things change, actually, a few thousand people going into the streets. That can raise the question, but when it comes to these sort of structural issues that are embedded in capitalism itself, you have to build a mass movement. And there's a very interesting article in the Washington Post today, actually, that I think, which is a report on some academic research that's been done about how democracy, over the last 100 years, democracy has been won in different parts of the world. And it's actually a bit shocking because it's quite, I think it's quite Eurocentric, and it basically asks the question, what social forces most effectively bring about democracy? This was the research. And it's a bit dismissive of the peasantry in many parts of the world. It completely writes the Russian Revolution out of history, which is bizarre. But the conclusion it does come to, through a massive amount of research, is that those movements are most successful at winning democracy when they involve the industrial working class. And this is a kind of liberal bit of research. And I think that's true. Once you get to it, you need to get to a situation where, and we're seeing strikes in America, there's a big strike wave at the moment. There's the beginnings of maybe the recovery of industrial confidence in this country. You need to be thinking about, and the XR, to be fair, and certainly the students are doing this, how do we link this advanced consciousness with the power of working people across society to bring things to a halt? And that seems to me to be the key question.